Well, good evening. It's good to see you all tonight. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online tonight. We hope that everyone's having a good week. And I know that last week we weren't able to be here on a Wednesday night due to the weather. It was really gross outside, so it's good to see you all here tonight. And I'll just be honest with you, on those weeks where we don't get to have Wednesday together, it really throws me off. Like, I spent the rest of the week not really being sure what day it was. Like, I rely on this time together that we get in the middle of the week more than sometimes I realize, even for something as simple as keeping my schedule, if nothing else, right? No, it's more than that. This is a time whenever we get to spend just a little bit together, remembering what's most important for us. I can never really tell just how much I miss these Wednesdays until we don't have one. So on this Wednesday in particular, I'm especially glad to be here with you. Have you ever gotten into an argument that you just could not win? How do you usually respond whenever you find yourself in a situation like that? This is a question that I started class with recently with some of my 8th grade students. We like to have questions to kind of prep us for what we're going to be learning on the day. So I laid this out there before them. How do you respond whenever you get into an argument that you can't win? I want to share some of their answers with you tonight. And I think that you'll be interested. Maybe some of these things are what you would have said whenever you were in 8th grade on how you would respond to an argument that you just can't win. This is what they told me. One of them said, I keep saying what I think is right until the other person just gives up. Maybe you feel that too. One said, I start agreeing with them to see if they will mess up and say what I was saying originally. Like reverse psychology kind of stuff, right? One of them said, I just walk away whenever they don't agree with me. One said, I start insulting them or like trying to attack their character to see like if they'll give up. These are some vicious kids, I tell you what. Like, I am being selective in the answers I choose, of course. One of them said, I don't get into that kind of situation, Mr. Wallis. And I said, really? And they said, no, I always win my arguments. So, I can say that maybe at times in my youth I would have said something similar, so I can't blame them too much. Finally, one of them said, I just get sarcastic and tell them good job a lot whenever I feel like I'm in that situation. I've only given you a few of their answers. Of course, I had many students who said wonderful things, great things, and others who said some things that were even harsher than the things that I've shared with you tonight. And I promise you that some of my students were joking around whenever they gave me these answers. They know that these things can be a little silly at the beginning of class. But as I was listening to them share those answers, I couldn't help but think to myself, is this really all that different than what we as adults tend to do when we get into arguments like this? Like when you get into an argument and it's just one of those like stalemates, it's locked. The other person isn't seeing it your way and you sure aren't budging for them. Is it really all that different than how we sometimes settle our arguments? How do we respond whenever we get into those arguments that just can't seem to be settled? I'll be the first to tell you that I can be a little bit stubborn from time to time. And so I feel this pretty acutely. When you get into these kinds of stalemates, it can often feel like there's just no possible resolution. Like the conflict is just going to be ongoing forever and ever. And as we continue in our series tonight that we've been in together for the last few weeks, Fish Out of Water, we're going to be looking at some of Daniel's challenges as his culture comes head-to-head in a clash with the culture of the place that he is now being forced to live, in the exile land for the Israelites of Babylon. And it feels like in our story tonight, as we look at it together, that really there just cannot be any resolution. Like Daniel is either going to have to give up his integrity or he's going to have to stubbornly and aggressively champion his cause. What will he choose? Will he assimilate or will he withstand? I think that you'll see what I mean as we read the text together tonight. So we'll be reading from Daniel chapter 1, if you want to go ahead and be turning there. And we'll be starting in verse 1. which if you were here a few weeks ago, I know that we were off for a week and it's been a couple weeks, Stephen actually read this first verse as he introduced Daniel's story to us a little bit. It says in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave King Jehoiakim of Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These Nebuchadnezzar brought to the land of Shinar, and he placed the vessels in the treasury of his own gods." So, as we mentioned in the introductory part of our series talking about Daniel, Daniel finds himself in the land of Babylon due to no fault that we're aware of his own, but rather because Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is used by God to take his people into captivity in Babylon due to their wickedness, and they're becoming like their Gentile neighbors. And so now Daniel finds himself in this exile, in a faraway place. And I want us to keep reading and look at what happens to him while he's there. We're told in verse 3, "Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine, and they were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego." So Daniel and his friends find themselves in this place that they don't necessarily want to be in. And not only that, but now they've been hand-selected to be a part of a training program that will eventually allow them to work in the king's palace as a part of Nebuchadnezzar's court. It's going to be a 3-year-long program. And why is it that Daniel is chosen? Why is he in this situation? It happens to be because of who Daniel is. We find out that Daniel is a rather important individual. He and his friends are from either the royal family or the nobility. It's these choice people from the kingdom of Judah who are chosen to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's court. And not just that, Daniel is chosen because we're told he's handsome. Good looks actually did get Daniel somewhere that he didn't want to be in this story. Who would have thought? He's wise, knowledgeable, insightful, and last but not least, he's competent. So much so that Nebuchadnezzar's palace master chooses him and his friends to serve in the king's court. What we get here is really a very glowing picture of Daniel, isn't it? Like, what an awesome, upstanding guy that we're told about here. And yet it's for that reason that he's chosen to learn the language and the custom of his captors. But why really is Nebuchadnezzar wanting to bring these people whose kingdom he's captured into his palace in the first place? Why go to all the trouble of teaching these people who have no knowledge of his culture and his language? Why would the king want to bring these kinds of people into his palace? I think as we look, it's because we see Daniel is going to find himself at the center of a cultural conflict. Daniel is stuck between what we might see as two unmovable objects. And being from nobility, Daniel was chosen to become a part of this conquering kingdom's elite. He's the best and the brightest, but before he can be a real part of this new land that he's been brought into, he must be taught the right way to live, the right way to see the world. And here we see the cultural conflict. Nebuchadnezzar and his palace master and the kingdom of Babylon are taking the best and the brightest and teaching them about their way of life so that they can serve and further the kingdom of Babylon's agenda. their goals, their interest. And probably the most overlooked part of Daniel's fish out of water experience here is the changing of his name and his friends' names that happens in these verses. Daniel and all of his friends have their names changed from something that is originally God-honoring, God-praising, to something that honors not their God, but the gods of Babylon. Look and you'll see. Daniel's name, if you were to look it up, means God is my judge, which is going to be really fitting, I think, tonight. I want you to hold on to that as we look at the way that Daniel chooses to conduct himself. His name means God is my judge. But the palace master for Nebuchadnezzar changes his name to Belshazzar, which means Bel, one of the Babylonian gods. Bel, protect his life. His friends are named after the gods Aku and Nebo. It doesn't come out that way in our translation, but that's in fact what they're named for. And their names too had been God-honoring. So they've taken Daniel and they've said, this is who you are now. You used to be a servant. You used to be one who served this God. But now you'll be one who serves our gods. They're attacking his identity. They're saying, forget the person you used to be. This is the person that you are now. They offer him royal food and training, and all he has to do is give up his identity. We could say that this is his integrity as a person who follows Yahweh God. He can have a lavish life in the palace, a wonderful rest of his days, if only he will assimilate to this culture. And it's here that we would look at as far as our series has gone, and we would say that Daniel's integrity is truly tested. And it's different than whenever we looked a couple of weeks ago at how Joseph's integrity was tested. Joseph was living in a different place, yes. Like he was in Egypt, even though he shouldn't have been there. And the culture was different, but Joseph's test of integrity was about having good moral character, about working hard in the role that he was given, and not taking Potiphar's wife and having her for himself. And I think if you were to ask the Egyptians who were living around Joseph, they would say that those were things that made you a good person. Those were characteristics of someone with integrity. But as we look at Daniel's captors tonight, I would say that they're actually challenging his integrity in ways that ask him to jump out of his fishbowl, out of his place that he knows he's supposed to be, and into theirs. And so Daniel is left with a choice. What will he do? Will he assimilate? Will he maintain his integrity? And if he does, what will that look like? Daniel's entire belief system is coming into conflict with this Babylonian way of living, after all. Will he shout his opinion from the rooftops and keep shouting it until his adversaries just give up? Will he try and trick his captors into seeing things his way? Like, will he try and manipulate or subvert them? Will he walk away from the palace and say, I don't want to be a part of that? Will he insult, mistreat, or belittle the people who are in charge of him? Will he grow arrogant and see himself as right no matter what, without really ever offering an explanation for why? What we see from Daniel, I think, isn't any of those things, but a perfect example of how to deal with those issues of conflict that might otherwise seem impossible to fix. Daniel shows his integrity not by being the loudest or the most violent or the smartest or the most haughty. He actually shows his integrity through his humility. Daniel chooses to prove his integrity through his actions and let his God work on his behalf. So if we keep reading the story, we'll pick up again in verse 8. It says, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he made a request of the palace master, and this is what he said. He said, I would like to not eat the royal food and the royal wine. Now we're told that God granted Daniel favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to him, "Look, I'm afraid of my lord the king. He is the one who chose what you should eat and what you should drink. He picked this food and drink himself for you. And there is no law that got a little messed up there. He said, I'm afraid of these things. And if he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your age, then you would endanger my head with the king." So Daniel asked the guard whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He said, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations, and you can deal with your servants accordingly to what you observe." And so the guard agreed to this proposal, and he tested them from 10 days. So the palace master says to Daniel, when Daniel makes this request, he says, "I don't want to eat and drink what's being put before me. We just want to eat vegetables and drink water," which is not something that I have ever said once in my life when offered great food. I never said, "Please give me a plate full of veggies instead." Those of you who know me know that that really hits home. Daniel says, "This is what we want." And the palace master is inclined to listen to Daniel. But he says, "Look, it's not just you that this could affect. The king has told me to do this thing. And if you guys turn out to be worse for it, it's going to be my head that's on the chopping block." He's inclined to listen to Daniel. We're told that God had given him favor here with the palace master, but he's just not quite sure. And so Daniel makes this proposition. You could call it a compromise of sorts. But I want to make it clear first tonight, before we talk about this, that what Daniel did was a subtle but clear message about where he stood while in the palace of the king. Daniel did not have to, and I think we need to make sure we're aware of this tonight. Daniel did not have to reject the royal food and drink that was being offered to him. It wasn't like Israelites were expected to be vegetarians. There was no stipulation in the law of Moses that said that they could not drink wine. Daniel's not rejecting these things, and maybe sometimes when we read it, we gloss over it in a way that we say, well, he was just following Israelite dietary laws. We don't even know particularly what the food was. Sometimes people will say it's meat versus vegetables. We're not told that that's specifically what he was being forced to eat here. We see that when he asked for vegetables instead, maybe there's a contrast. But as far as we can tell, there's no kind of restriction being placed on Daniel that says he cannot eat the food and drink the drink that's being offered to him by the officials in the royal palace. He's not rejecting them because of that. He rejects these things because he's choosing to uphold his integrity in a way that is still available to him in this foreign place. Look at what Daniel and his friends are being put through. They have been uprooted from their homeland and dropped into the royal palace of a different king. Not only that, they've had their names, the very names that used to be God-honoring, changed to honor the gods of this foreign people. They were selected to participate in this training, and as far as we know, they had no choice in the matter. They didn't get a say in all of this. But look at what they're doing here. Daniel and his friends are choosing to exercise their ability to eat food or not in a way that makes them distinct and in a way that allows them to honor their God. What Daniel and his friends choose to do here, rather than jumping into the comfort of just another fishbowl that's available to them, allows them to stand out in a way that rejects that lavish lifestyle that is being chosen for them by the Babylonians. It allows Daniel and his friends to say, not so fast. We want to live a little bit differently than the way that you've chosen for us. And what we see from Daniel is that he doesn't insist that every other person who's a part of this training program lives like he does. He doesn't expect all of those who are training to be royal officials to eat just vegetables and drink water with him. He is in a different culture after all. It doesn't make sense for the people in this context to all do this. Why would they? Why would they reject the royal cuisine that's being offered to them? It's got to be delicious. Daniel isn't doing any of that. He's making, I think, a compromise of sorts. He doesn't need everyone to do it this way, but Daniel and his friends are choosing to separate themselves from this lifestyle and to maintain their integrity before the Lord their God. And even so, Daniel and his friends are at first only doing this on a trial basis. They don't say, we're going to consistently do this. Like they say, just give us a shot. And you know the palace master was scared. Daniel says, I just want 10 days. 10 days. And that will prove that what we're asking for is in fact good. Like, give me 10 days to prove that what I'm asking you is good. I promise I'm a person of integrity. I wouldn't do this if it was going to put you at risk. Daniel says, let me show you. And we see what happens in the following verses. Starting in verse 15, we're told at the end of those 10 days, it was observed that Daniel and his friends, as they appeared before him, appeared better and fatter than all of the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine so that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables. And to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of wisdom and literature. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, 3 years of their lives, and now here they are in the presence of the king. And the king spoke with them. And among all of those who had been a part of this program, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And therefore they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found Daniel and his friends to be 10 times better than all of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. And Daniel was so good in this role that was given him by King Nebuchadnezzar that we're told in verse 21 that he continued there until the first year of Cyrus, that is Cyrus, the king of the Persians, Cyrus, who allowed the Israelites to go back out of exile. Daniel serves in this role all the way through until his people are allowed to return home. What Daniel sees as integrity in this story is absolutely, without a doubt, different than what his Babylonian captors would tell you is integrity. But whenever Daniel is put to the test, it becomes clear that his integrity, his belief system, his faith in God is true. Daniel and his friends are not only allowed to continue their distinct diet, but they actually, as we read, earn higher marks than all of the other people who are being trained to be a part of the king's court. What Daniel makes different does not keep the king from inquiring of him. What makes Daniel different, rather, doesn't keep the king from inquiring of him. Rather, it causes him to rely on him in difficult situations. If anything, we could say that Daniel's distinct integrity allows him more opportunities to gain influence while his people are in captivity. And after seeing Daniel's example and the results of his decisions, his captors come to respect him in his opinions and his values all the more. Daniel's integrity in this story is tested, and it is found to be abundant and enriching for everyone that he comes in contact with. And I wonder if that isn't the lesson for us tonight. You know, we look at a culture all around us, and it's easy for us, I think, as we've talked about in this series, to feel like fish out of water. And when we do feel like everyone around us is different and everyone else around us is coming from a different perspective, what is our first reaction? Do we argue? Do we try and argue until we can force people to submit to seeing things the way we do? Do we hurl insults or belittle the opinions of others? Do we walk away from people and call them challenging and say they just won't listen? Are we arrogant? Do we scoff at the people in our culture who see things differently than us? If our integrity as Christians was simply an intellectual exercise, then it might work that way. If it was just a matter of being right in our minds, then maybe we could go about it this way. But I think tonight that our world is a lot more like Daniel's world than we realize. We're surrounded by people that don't share the same values as us, and that might be increasingly true. We cannot expect the people around us to see things our way. And our neighbors might not be so easily swayed by our words. So how is it that we can show them the validity, the reasonableness, if you've been in Stephen's Sunday night class, of our faith, of the choices that we make that seem so foreign to them? I think, like Daniel, it has to be through our actions. When the palace master sees the result of Daniel's diet, he decides to let him go ahead and keep doing it. He says, if that works, if it's better even, yeah, keep going. Keep doing that. And I think when people in our community who may have different belief systems than we do see the fruit of our actions, that even if they don't agree with us, that they would see and say there is some benefit to our ideals. Our integrity as Christians is that even if no one else chooses to follow Jesus because of the way that we act, that we will still keep living that way because of our devotion and our commitment to Christ and His gospel. And that's what I think for the people in our community who don't share our sense of integrity, our values, our belief system, allows them to see the validity even as they disagree with us. This testing gives us the opportunity to showcase to the world the goodness and the decency and the truth that is within Christ Jesus' teachings. And I think that is truly always attractive to the people who would otherwise be disinterested in the gospel. We might not be able to sway people with just our words. But if our actions, if our integrity can be tested in a way that displays the glory of our God, then we just might cause people to honor or even to accept the truth of Christ Jesus' gospel. As a final word, I'd like to suggest that this issue of integrity and proving it by our actions is not just something that we do outside of the church. The way that we deal with our differences of culture and opinion inside of the church shows something to our world today as well that's just as valuable, I think. The lead-in for me asking my students that question about how do you respond whenever you find yourself at an impasse? Like, what do you do whenever you're in an argument that you just can't seem to see eye to eye with another person on? Was actually a story that many of you are probably familiar with. We've been studying Acts with my 8th graders this year, and there are two great men in Acts who are almost inseparable in all the stories that we see them in. Their names are Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas, after all, is the one who, whenever Paul comes to Jerusalem, a new Christian, and the rest of the Christian leaders there are suspicious of him, Barnabas vouches for him. He stands up and he says, we can trust this guy. When Paul goes to Tarsus, he goes back home, and we don't know what he's doing there, but he's far away from where he is going to end up needing to be. Who is it that goes and brings him to Antioch to be a part of the ministry that's going on there? It's Barnabas. Barnabas is the one who accompanies Paul on that first crucial missionary journey. And they convert so many Gentiles. And really, when they get back, they say that God has sprung open the door for Jew and Gentile alike to come to Christ. But in Acts 15, we're told about this argument that just can't be settled between them. As they set out on their second missionary journey, we know that Barnabas wants to take a man by the name of John Mark with them. But Paul's hesitant because John Mark had actually gone with them on their first missionary journey. And when the going got tough, and when the people started chasing them out of towns, and whenever they started deciding, maybe we need to stone these guys, by the time they got to that, John Mark said, I'm out. He left. So Barnabas said, let's take him again. I think he's ready. And Paul said, that is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. He left us high and dry. Why would we take him with us? And it wasn't like just a friendly disagreement. It says that it was so heated that they decided to part ways. These two inseparable workers for the kingdom split and went different directions over this disagreement that they could not solve. Barnabas took John Mark with him and went to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas, and he went back to Phrygia and Pamphylia, to Cilicia, technically. But what do we see even in that kind of a disagreement between brothers in Christ? Was there an impasse that they could not get across? Absolutely. They decided to split company over this. But I think the most encouraging thing about that story is they did not let that disagreement, that argument that they just could not resolve, they did not let it stop the work that God wanted to be done through them. They said their goal when they decided to go out on that second journey was to go back and strengthen the churches that they had already been to. So what did they do? Even in the midst of that heated argument, Barnabas went back to Cyprus, the first place that they had been, and Paul trekked back up through Asia Minor, the place where their journey had ended. They did that work anyway. They did it separately, but they didn't let that disagreement stop the work that needed to be done. As Christians, sometimes, even whenever we disagree, we have to put that disagreement to the side, even if it's something that we can't ever see eye to eye on. We have to put that to the side enough that God's work can still be done through us. And I think that if the world sees us acting in that kind of a way, in a culture that really just praises disunity and individualism, I think that they will see the value in that as well. I don't know how this message reaches you tonight, whether it's as we look out to our community or whether it's as we look inward at ourselves in the way that we deal with one another. But however it is that the Spirit is calling you to display God-like integrity, Christ-like integrity this week for our world to see, I pray that you would do so now, that you would respond as we stand and as we sing together.